Roger Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the heart-mind dialectic and the phenomenology of views on how what we think impacts how we feel and vice versa. And the main idea of this work, featured in The Map is Indestructible, is to tear down this idea, kind of this notion that there are some mind people and there are some heart people, there are some people that are more rational, other people that are more emotional, and so on and so forth. And obviously there are people that have different emphasis, different ordering of what they prioritize in their lives and think about, and what motivates them. But at the end of the day, what we tend to think about is reflected by what we feel, and what we feel is reflected by what we think. And sure, everyone knows that when you ask them directly, but I think the profundity of this really needs to be stressed. We could almost say that the heart is located in the brain, and the brain in the chest, the mind in the chest, if you will. And worldviews orient emotions as emotions orient worldviews. And if we're not really aware of how emotion affects our thinking, then we may conclude that what we think is purely disinterested, that has no emotional investment at all, when really that could be there quite a bit. And a lot of this really kind of comes out just in how we focus on things, what we just choose to write about, what we choose to think about. All of this tends to be, what we think about tends to be oriented by what we're invested in and what we feel. And yeah, when somebody does like a math problem, it's easy to identify the mind as distinct from the heart, because the mind takes such a primary role when dealing with math. But most of life is not like a math problem. Most of life is a mixture of subjective involvement, dealing with objects, emotion, mind. It's all just one big mixture. But we can ignore the complexity of that mixture and thus de-emphasize the need to come to terms with emotion and thinking. We could just, maybe a lot of what's happened is we've sacrificed subjectivity for quote-unquote objectivity. We've sacrificed emotion for thinking. And as a result, we've become emotionally undeveloped, immature, and that has led to a lot of consequences. Some of the consequences that psychoanalysis will describe, some of those various pathologies. We simply can't get the influence of feeling out of thought. There is always going to be some involvement of feeling in thought. But that we might have incentive to deny that, because the more we can kind of go, oh, thought is just thought, the more we can feel like what we think is quote-unquote objective, that it is not merely our interpretation, but what is. And that would benefit ideology, which is what The Map is Indestructible is going to talk a lot about. There might be ideological incentive to believe that it's possible to separate thinking and feeling, so that we can more ignore our feelings basically, or we can ignore being critical of our thinking because we're more likely to believe it is quote unquote objective. And it's almost like if emotion kind of organizes focus or directs us toward what we're going to think about, it's almost like how a house hides the foundation. You don't really see the foundation of a house when you're in it. It's invisible. Likewise, thought almost has a way of making its emotional foundation hidden. We don't really experience, here's the issue. The moment you start talking about emotion as the foundation of thought, you have to what? Think about it. And that's kind of weird, right? It's very difficult to thinking without having emotional involvement. And if you think about the emotional involvement of emotions in thought, well, then you're thinking about it, not so much feeling it. So it's always kind of concealing. It's difficult to approach this precisely because to approach it, you have to do it in a mode that makes it seem like thought is only involved. We could say that the mind hides the heart, which is a problem only worsened by the fact that we can only think about how the mind hides the heart. Making it easier to convince ourselves that we're quote-unquote objective. And again, I'm not trying to say that objectivity is even possible in a technical sense or that subjectivity is bad. The whole point of this is to say that those categories are a dichotomy that we just get trapped moving between, kind of dialectically moving between them, and we never move to speculative reason, which is very problematic. So to kind of make an example, if you go into New York City believing it's a good city, you're probably just going to naturally, without even thinking about it, notice the good of New York. You'll talk about the beauty of the skyline. You'll talk about the good food. You'll talk about how everyone has a passion they're pursuing. What will happen is the good of New York will probably be vivid to you. It will just stand out to you, and then you'll be thinking about that good. But the fact that you think about that good makes it seem like your conclusions are based on pure thought, quote unquote. But really, the fact that the goodness of the food and the passion of people stood out to you, quote unquote, as vividly, will be due to emotion. And then you'll begin thinking about why those premises are true. But if you go into New York thinking it's a bad city, you'll probably notice the smell. You'll notice that everyone is busy. There's no people aren't paying attention to one another. You'll talk about how the food is expensive. And again, those things will stand out to you, and then you'll think about them. It's not so much... I mean, it's of course possible to think about the prices being high first, but the framework of which is an emotional framework will probably motivate the thinking versus the other way around. It's of course not impossible to do it the other way, but it's probably less natural, and ultimately it's just impossible. You know, the paper's going to say we can't really talk about heart and mind. We have to talk about like heart/mind, and that's a very different way of thinking about it. The paper will then go into Adam Smith with his extraordinary theory of moral sentiments that really talks about human motivation. There's a paper called Probable Cause that will expound upon different things. And we also are just more likely to... So the basic point, Adam Smith has that example where he says if you cut your thumb, that's probably more likely to motivate your action than hearing about a tragedy in a distant country. Is that moral? That's not what Smith's... that's a different question. But it's just natural for motivation to organize us according to what directly affects us. And then we think about our mind will really be focused on how to make my thumb feel better versus how to help the people in the foreign country. That's just naturally how the mind goes. And so we really have to pay attention to how thinking is directed by feelings, and we're likely not going to do that if we believe in heart and mind, not heart/mind. And that could benefit ideology as well, because if we believe heart and mind are separate, then ideology will probably present our belief in that ideology as non-emotionally influenced, thus making us feel like we're not in an ideology but the quote-unquote truth. The papers are going to make an example of the Obergefell Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage, and on the idea that the very experience of reading that decision and the dissents is probably greatly influenced by if you're a conservative or a liberal. And it's not merely like the phenomenology, like the sentences that stand out, the ideas that stand out, like things that you'll remember versus forget. All of these are likely situated with one's ideological framework. So Barney Frank had a response to Scalia's dissent. He called him a homophobe, and he says, there's one point in the decision, the dissent, where Scalia says the substance of today's decree is not of immense personal importance to me, and Barney Frank says, yeah, right, and he's like, that's very insincere. He's just saying that, and the point is, maybe that's true. Maybe Barney Frank is correct, but the likelihood of a liberal not believing Scalia is much higher than the likelihood of a conservative believing Scalia, because again, this is the thing. Ultimately, belief is very emotional. We tend to think belief in assent is purely a thought activity, but it's very emotional. And what we choose to believe and what to trust tends to be very tied to how we feel. And this leads to all sorts of trouble, because we're then going to believe we're kind of being objective, like, Scalia is a conservative Catholic, so it's really, really unlikely that when he says the decision is of no personal significance, he's lying, right? Where a conservative will say, it's possible for a Supreme Court judge to separate his duty, his job, from his personal life, so, we'll take Scalia as his word. Why do we feel as if it's possible to separate one's position in the Supreme Court from their personal life in one instant as a conservative, whereas a liberal, you can't believe that? Why do you feel that? Why do you think that? Both, from an intellectual standpoint, both are valid possibilities. So the decision comes down to a feeling, probably. Most of it, something like a feeling at least. If you feel cynicism or if you feel truth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It all tends to be emotionally situated. And we can just go through political topic after political topic. If you're reading something and you read a line that says abortion is murder, if you're a conservative and you hear that, even a conservative may flinch, but they're probably not going to stop reading. They're not going to assume the entire document is propaganda. Whereas a liberal might. They might go, the very fact that someone would assert that destroys their credibility as a thinker, and therefore I am objective, or I am actually intellectually responsible not to take this person seriously. Well, the same goes if a conservative reads abortion is a woman's right. The conservative may roll their eyes and be like, oh, they're just saying that. They don't really, that's such a lame, they've never, offered an argument for why abortion isn't murder. So the conservative could start taking the writer less seriously, on and on. And, in the experience of the sentence does not present itself as an emotional reaction, but as a critical thinking. It presents itself as an experience of critical thinking. And so we're likely to get tricked by it and then, just stay in our ideology. So the map is indestructible. It's all about ideology and maps. And in this, we just see ways that maps benefit from the myth of splitting heart and mind versus belief in heart/mind. The paper will go through some more on the consequences of this and how we should approach it. And for more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, and so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.